Rachel Bovard at the Conservative Partnership Institute, and I'm here today with Josh Hammer, Ben Weingarten, Emily Jashinsky, and this is NatCon Squad. Today, we're talking about everything from Joe Biden's executive order on transgenderism, green energy and efforts to de-industrialize America, all the drama about GameStop, and finally, efforts to kick Marjorie Taylor Greene out of the House of Representatives. Hi, everyone. I'm going to kick it off to start today with to Emily.
Hey everyone, we're going to start by talking about the executive order that Joe Biden immediately signed into law regarding transgenderism. It basically said that sexual identity, it said that biological sex must be interpreted as gender identity as well, that category is necessarily then under the umbrella of sex, as it should be interpreted legally and by public institutions, by federally funded institutions. This is a sweeping decision to do with the stroke of a pen. It's a very, very big deal, and it has really, really wide-ranging ramifications. I want to actually start by throwing a question over to Josh, because this one part of the controversy in the decision or in the executive order, which you can read through online and on the White House's website, is it's the way that it used the Bostock decision and Justice Neil Gorsuch's decision in that Supreme Court case to justify the executive order. Josh, what did you think about that, and what does it get wrong?
So thanks, Emily. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page here, the Bostock decision was a ruling on Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that came out last June, so June 2020, where the left basically accomplished, the left with some helping hands on the pseudo right, we might say, accomplished with a stroke of a pen what the left legislatively in the US Senate and House was not able to accomplish over decades, at least 30, 40, 50 years. What they essentially did was they read sex in the statute of Title VII to include both sexual orientation and so-called gender identity, the latter obviously being a fabrication of the gender studies academic department that, as you know, as the kids would say, was not even a thing back when the statute was passed in 1964. So this is obviously a 6-3 decision. It was written by putatively well-vetted, highly trained, Federal Society trained Justice Neil Gorsuch. It was an abominable decision. I've written prolifically about it and will continue to do so. But one thing that Justice Gorsuch did in this opinion, an opinion that I called in an op-ed the very next day in the New York Post, the quote, Roe versus Wade of religious liberty. What he did in his opinion was he purported to limit it to Title VII. He purported to limit it to employment, hiring, and firing decisions. But as every observer known to man was able to instantly recognize, there was no way that this was legally tenable. Once you open up this can of worms to the specific confines of Title VII, if it's discrimination to make hiring or firing decisions based on so-called gender identity, then it obviously is going to be the same sort of discrimination for Title IX decisions with respect to women's sports. And Gorsuch specifically said in this opinion that he was cabining it to Title VII, that everything else, locker rooms, restrooms, sports, NCAA funding under Title IX, all this would be decided another day. But at the time, all of us who could read between the lines here called BS. We knew that this was nonsense. So if you take Justice Gorsuch at his literal word, caution, you should not do that. If you did do that, then this decision was legally erroneous on those grounds. But this is the most easily foreseeable thing in the world. There are obviously tremendous non-legal ramifications here leading to the destruction of women's sports in general. Obviously, it's from my perspective, I defer to Emily and Rachel on this, obviously. But from my perspective, it is a total bastardization of everything that the feminist movement fought for decades. They fought for Title IX for women's sports. Think about all the athletic achievements of the great women's sports heroes, Jackie Joyner-Kersee, all the great Olympians who fought to have their own spotlight, their own time there on television from the cameras, and now they're just gonna, from my perspective, just get run over by biological men who think, I suppose, that they're biological men who think that they're women. But we'll see.
And actually, even sex segregated spaces in general, not just in sports, were something that the women's movement fought for and earned, from locker rooms to restrooms. And this actually, again, with the stroke of the pen, we saw the Obama administration do this through Dear Colleague letters in the final year of his presidency through the education department. And then Biden jumped in and signed an executive order literally on his first day of office that had similarly sweeping ramifications. I continue to use that word, and it really is true. What's interesting about Josh's point is that he's saying, based on Gorsuch's opinion, actually the Biden executive order isn't wildly unreasonable because that opinion was so broad and probably poorly conceived. Rachel, what do you think about Biden's decision to use the executive order to implement a measure this significant?
Well, this is how we govern now. I don't know if you've noticed, but we don't have a functional legislature. So everything we see is from a very muscular executive and the juristocracy, right? Our network of judges that just make law from the bench. And I think that one of the most striking things about the Bostock decision to me was how appreciative and almost overtly relieved the legislature was that they no longer had to deal with this issue. Like, you had Republican senators going on the record saying, hey, I'm glad somebody did it effectively. Right? You only had 3 Republican senators come to the Senate floor, Mike Lee, James Langford, and Josh Hawley. Those are the only 3 that could be bothered to say, I think this might have some problems. And so I'm not, to your point, I'm not at all surprised to see Joe Biden do this. This is effectively what we do now. We govern by executive order. The next guy comes in and undoes them, right? But the ones that I think cement themselves in the popular consciousness don't go away. And I'm afraid this might be one of them. And, I think sometimes you get people who say, well, these things are popular in society, so why wouldn't you want the judges to do them if they have overwhelming popular support? This was sort of the issue with gay marriage and sort of gay rights. But when you do it in such an undemocratic fashion, right, it leaves lingering taste in the minority community's mouth. And by this, I mean people who hold minority views. In this case would be, traditional conservatives, religious conservatives, right? This is why we have a democratic representative process to deal with the questions that really aren't one of law at their very root. They are one of social order. They're one of how we decide we want to live in relation to one another. And that is a function for our legislature versus our courts. And so this whole process, I think, has been flipped on its head. But until you have a legislature that wants to stand up and scream, stop, or I have a different view, this is what we're going to see from here on out.
Something interesting, I did a podcast with Terry Schilling recently, who's worked extensively on this issue in a political sense, and he sort of altered the maxim that conservatives cling to, and I think rightfully so, from Andrew Breitbart, that politics is downstream of culture. He said there's an important caveat to that, which is that politics does also, it's sort of reciprocal, right? It does go back and forth, and politics can influence culture. And I want to ask Ben a leading question, if I may, which is that a lot of times we see decisions like this normalizing things in the culture. So when something's codified by the federal government, it can normalize things in the culture. Ben, what do you think it says about the left, and what do you think how do you think this will impact and influence our culture in the next few years, that this was one of the very first things Joe Biden, Mr. Moderate, centrist, unifier, temperature lowerer, Joe Biden did when he took office?
There's a lot of lead to that leading question. I guess my first response would be the left uses every possible level of power to effectuate political changes and cultural changes in tandem that ultimately reinforce each other. So when the left is out of power, they still have all the other commanding heights, and usually most of the Republicans who are representing us in Washington are at best controlled opposition with respect to the left. So I think there's an element of look at how the other side operates, and the other side operates with using every possible vehicle at their disposal to ultimately put forth their policy priorities. There's another element of this, which is, as has been really, I think, aptly stated so far, the administrative state ultimately is our legislative branch in conjunction with the federal judges, which basically points to, I think, a real weakness on our side, which is that we've ceded the entire administrative state. Obviously, some of us would like to abolish it altogether, but absent that, we have to be competing in it, which we're not doing. And then I think there are 2 broader points to be made. I mean, one is the fact that notice how the left always gets their Supreme Court justice picks right. And our side, and maybe you'd say it's a strength that there's intellectual diversity, but the fact that you never know how it's ultimately going to end up with our picks also speaks to a real weakness on our side. So I've ticked off a lot of weaknesses here. But then, I mean, the last thing is, yeah, that notion of moderate Joe Biden. It's very clear that with the more than 36 executive actions that he's taken so far, which would have gotten calls of, authoritarian, fascist, Hitlerian under his predecessor, he's putting forth their entire agenda using the executive branch, just like they will do whatever they can through the legislative branch and then through their auxiliaries at the commanding heights of society. So anyone who had any view that this was going to be in some sense moderate, there's really not that much difference between a Joe Biden and a Bernie Sanders. Directionally, they're pretty much exactly the same. It's just a matter of the face that you put on it and the extent of the policies. And the left's goal is to push as far left as is politically possible using every lever that they have. And we should really take that to heart.
I think Ben's point about the varying ways that Republicans and Democrats have exerted the force of the federal government is actually a great way to tee up our next segment. So I'm going to toss it over to Josh to pick up where Ben just left off.
Yeah, so thank you, Emily. So look, governing by executive fiat, we've now seen that the great unifier in chief, Joe Biden, has issued more executive orders and proclamations than President Trump, President Obama, or even President George W. Bush in an equivalent time span. And one thing that Joe Biden has done repeatedly thus far in his barely over two-week-old, however old it is, administration, whenever you're going to listen to this podcast, is he has taken a sledgehammer to the American oil and gas industry. He has taken what was America's great energy revolution, I think, over the past 10 years, one of the most unheralded, probably undercovered, underwritten about things that has happened in this country. America went from a mass energy importer. We're pretty young on this podcast, but our parents can remember kind of the Arab oil embargo after the Yom Kippur War back in the 1970s, when gas stations in the United States shut down. Vladimir Putin, for decades, both before and after the fall of the Soviet Union, used kind of petro warfare as kind of his tool or his blunt instrument of diplomacy worldwide. The United States used to be totally reliant upon Saudis, Iranians, Russians, all sorts of actors that we couldn't necessarily count on for our basic domestic energy needs. But with shale and fracking and everything that's happened in that industry over the past 10 years, we became an industry exporter. We became one of the largest exporters in the world of both oil and natural gas. It is just an incredible, incredible story. I mean, speaking personally, just briefly, my first job after law school was, I worked at a big law firm in Houston, Texas, and all of it was an oil and gas shop. All of the projects I worked on were based out in the Permian Basin, out in Oklahoma, Wyoming. We were just fracking the crap basically out of these lands, as we should do, because fracking oil and gas is not just good for national security. It is good for jobs. It is good for the economy. It is good for everyone other than the climate change hysterical crowd. But cue the climate change hysterical crowd, because that's obviously what Joe Biden and who he has catered to upon assuming office. He's canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, thousands of union jobs. This is allegedly still the party of the blue collar working man. From my perspective, doesn't seem like they can hold a candle to that claim any longer. They've canceled all new fracking on federal lands in general. They've stopped drilling in Anwar, Arctic Wildlife National Refuge up in Alaska. And they've also told all federal agencies to procure specifically green products and to tailor all prospective federal infrastructure needs to reduce climate pollution. They've, of course, rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, which only hurts America. China and Russia are obviously not going to reduce their pollution emissions. So broad perspective, and Rachel would love your thoughts on this, because I work with you so closely in a number of circles, including some of this more kind of realigned GOP stuff. It seems to me that the Democrats are just increasing their war on the deplorables. They are increasing their war on the American heartland. They don't give a crap about de-industrialization. They are just, all of this basically is trying to abet the Chinese Communist Party. It is going to hurt the American working man. And it just seems to me like all this is going to accelerate the realignment currently happening between America's two political parties.
That was actually going to be my question for you, was how you see this kind of framing that debate, because as you pointed out, there's a ton of union jobs that were lost here. And not only that, those unions made a bet with Joe Biden, right? A lot of those unions endorsed him. And his first, action out of the gate is to kind of take a sledgehammer to a bunch of these jobs. But I guess we do talk a lot about sort of the changing demographics of the GOP, and we saw a lot of those sort of union working class voters come in to the Trump base. But where I have a problem is that I don't see the Republican Party willing to capitalize on that. Right? You have to actually respond to those voters and what they're asking for. True, sure, we could try to give them the Keystone Pipeline back, but it's bigger than that, right? It's not just about the Keystone Pipeline. And so I guess is where I sit. We don't really have any leadership on this front. And I think part of that is because for so long, we've been raised in this ideology of like unions are bad, and we have no language to talk about unions other than they're bad. And so I think, we have a leadership vacuum on how to address where the Democrats are failing. We don't really have a way to come in and pick up those voters. So I don't know if Emily or Ben, you have any thoughts on that either.
I definitely have thoughts on the point about unions and the point about, even just thinking that this is another one of Joe Biden's early decisions. I think it's clearly shows the Democratic Party is no longer interested in the white working class. And I think that's a calculation that is coming strategically out of Washington, D.C. I think when they saw the election results of 2016, that started percolating. And then when we got to 2020 and we had behind us in the rearview mirror 4 years of conversation about the sort of irredeemable bigotry of the white working class, and that you have this aging and dying and declining demographic of people who Democrats can't really communicate with anymore for ideological reasons, because you can't communicate to the white working class and also placate your base. And they've realized that that's sort of an impossible line to toe and an impossible balance to strike. So I think this coming from Joe Biden, think about this. Joe Biden, I can say it, 3 times, but I still can't emphasize it enough. The kind of politician that Joe Biden has styled himself as for decades, and his time in the Senate, and his relationship with the state of Pennsylvania, his relationship with unions, his relationship with the working class. The fact that this is something he did immediately, I think really, really underscores and really is very suggestive of the fact that you have Democrats in conference rooms here in Washington, D.C., who have said, at this point, Randy Bryce, if anyone remembers Randy Bryce, who was a candidate who tried to unseat Paul Ryan before Paul Ryan stepped down in Wisconsin, not far from where I grew up, and had this ad and had this like working class union background and aesthetic. They've sort of realized that Randy Bryce's crash and burn. That's not it's not a plausible, it's not a usable model for them. It's not going to attract the voters that they want to sort of take back from the Republican Party. So I do think Republicans are poorly positioned to capture those voters because they lack the language to communicate with them, particularly in the sense that, like, as much as people like us talk about the failures of markets recently, we also still really do believe in the successes of markets. And so these are really difficult things to talk about in that context. So yeah, I think Republicans are poorly positioned to recapture those voters. But at the same time, I think it's really, really important to recognize a decision like this coming out early in the Biden administration tells us what Democrats in Washington, D.C. are talking about in terms of their political strategy going forward.
Yeah, I think what I'd add to that is, first of all, it's really something that the only industry that actually thrived under the Obama-Biden administration was the energy industry. So what does Joe Biden do? One of his first acts is try to destroy the golden goose of the American economy. And to Josh's point as well, something that in terms of our national security and geopolitical position is the greatest gift you could ask for if you are a Russian oligarch or a member of the CCP or any of a number of adversaries in the Middle East. I mean, the fact that we are not reliant on Middle Eastern oil is a tremendous thing for America. It frees up so much of our resources, our focus, our time, our energies. And the fact that you would make a decision that is so obviously a suicidal decision, a self-righteously suicidal decision, if I can say that, is an amazing thing. But on the political element of this, it does seem to me that Democrats have basically discounted the part of the country that is sort of pro-American, industrial focused, the middle class, essentially. That's not part of their coalition anymore. The fact that Republicans haven't completely dominated this ignored voter is an indictment of the party in many respects. And I think Democrats have basically made the calculation that ultimately, with their sort of high-low coalition combined with a DC and Puerto Rico statehood or mass amnesty or both, means that they don't ever need to worry about an increasingly shrinking middle class again. And that is absolutely something that Republicans should be clinging onto, and they should be embracing essentially the so-called, in political science terms, the median kind of Trump voter. And there's obviously an economic element to what the Trump agenda stood for, and a national security element as well. But it's also just an attitudinal one of pro-American, patriotic, pro-family, pro-community, pro-traditional values. These are bread and butter issues that any politician could see would be compelling issues. The chasm between the leadership down to rank and file members of the party at high levels and their actual voters is something where that needs to ultimately reconcile itself. You would hope that it would reconcile itself in the leaders ultimately acting in accordance with the people who vote for them. But I think more likely it's going to require primarying of a massive number of people in Washington. And I hope that the American people can summon the energy and the courage to put up such leaders and actually help them primary those who deserve to be primaried, because politicians do react when their careers are on the line ultimately. And we should never forget that. And just because many in a party represent most the so-called donor class doesn't mean that they don't care ultimately about their political livelihood, or they should care about their political livelihood, or they're in the wrong business.
Yeah, so I just want to quickly kind of accentuate something that Ben and I have both touched on, which is just the geopolitical ramifications of this. That cannot be understated here. Literally no one was happier than the Beijing Politburo when Joe Biden whipped out this rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. It is a direct appeasement of our worst geopolitical adversaries. It's also deeply hypocritical, I might add, for a political left that for decades, rightly or wrongly, I would argue sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, has decried America's involvement or broader interest in the Middle East in general, because the easiest way to bring our troops back, to take people out of these bases, to basically get out of the Middle East, is to become a net energy exporter, to make us not reliant upon Middle East oil from these inherently destabilizing countries. So it's grossly hypocritical to boot. I think very much, I agree with all three of you. I think the jury is very much still out as to whether the Republican Party can kind of reconcile this chasm between the donor class and its working class supporters and ultimately build a viable political coalition. But for now, it just seems like the left is just increasing its war on the deplorables. And that actually is a perfect segue, Ben, because I think next we're going to talk about the rickety stock market of last week and GameStop Reddit users versus hedge funds. So I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, it's amazing that this has become a cultural phenomenon, a story that's broken out far beyond financial markets. As probably all of our viewers and listeners are already aware, a ragtag group of Reddit warriors, largely operating on the brokerage platform Robinhood, were able to pull on the hedge funds and the large financial institutions, essentially what those in financial institutions and beyond are able to usually pull over on the retail investors, which is moving a marketplace. In this case, effectuating a massive short squeeze where one, and I think at least one other hedge fund, were essentially very bearish on GameStop and betting against GameStop's price in simplistic terms. And this ragtag group of Redditors came together and essentially pushed the stock to massive heights, which ultimately caused one of these hedge funds to crater and another one to have a near death, if not a death experience. And of course, the financial authorities, namely the brokerage houses, as well as potentially the SEC and others, stepped in and tried to suspend trading in GameStop and several other names as well that these Redditors were pursuing, where essentially some of these Redditors really liked GameStop as a stock. Others viewed this as sort of, I guess, class warfare by other means. And then others were just in it for the ride and the enjoyment, I guess, in a sort of nihilistic sense of sticking it to the hedge funds. Now, taking a step back from this for a second, what these Redditors were doing, the financial institutions on Wall Street do all the time. They can get behind a name, they can promote it on television, they can get together, take massive stakes, and push prices higher. It's always the institutions that ultimately control the game in the final analysis when it comes to financial markets. And I should step back and preface this by saying, I have no bias or beef against Wall Street. I actually, when I worked in college for 3 years at a leading investment bank. And when I came out of college, I worked as an investment banker for several years. So I know the people in this industry. I know how the industry operates. But the fact of the matter is the House does win ultimately when it comes to financial markets. Everyone who actually cares about markets should be rooting for the fact that the average retail, really trader more so than investor, could actually do what the institutions on Wall Street do. That's actually good competition. That's ultimately a helpful thing for a marketplace. But more broadly, what you saw in this clampdown on people trying to take a position on Wall Street was that they got savaged. A former SEC commissioner came out and compared them to the Capitol rioters. Again, trading was suspended, so they weren't allowed to push a name higher when Wall Street would have never stopped it if a stock had exploded over the course of a couple of days because of the actions of a couple hedge funds. They were even booted off, in some instances, messaging applications under the guise of hate speech. And that former SEC commissioner that I mentioned said, essentially, we might have to look at regulating, essentially, people talking on message boards about making prices move in different stocks, which again, if you turn on CNBC any day, you have any number of people, analysts, hedge fund managers, equity research providers, who are all essentially promoting different stocks, long or short. In the final analysis, this story is much bigger than just retail traders going up against the big hedge fund titans and doing what the hedge funds do on a normal basis and getting savaged for it. Ultimately, it's about another one of our major institutions being exposed to engage in essentially corrupt collusion, anti-competitive practices, closing ranks against the little guy who's trying to compete with them. That's something that goes far beyond financial markets. We see it with social media trying to shut down conflicting viewpoints. And we also see it, obviously, in the federal government, where anyone who dares challenge the political establishment gets savage. So that's why my argument would be this is about much more than GameStop and Reddit ragtag army against the financial institutions. This is ultimately about another institution being exposed as, at some level, corrupt at the top, controlling the game, and the emperor really has no clothes and can't sustain serious competition that it should have to sustain to better itself, if nothing else. So with that, I'll be happy to turn it over to Emily first for your response, especially as someone who comes at this from the culture side as well as the culture editor at the Federalist.
I was going to say, listen, I write about the Kardashians. This is wildly off of my beat, but I do think that it's all encapsulated in one thing that you said, which is the House always wins. I think over the last week, what we've seen is who our financial regulators are ultimately responsive to. So while the market absolutely can bear wonderful fruits for people in the middle class, the upper middle class, and average families around the country, absolutely. Ultimately, when push comes to shove, the House always wins. And I saw something really funny, which was a headline or a commenter, sort of like neoliberal commenter, lamenting that Reddit had turned the markets into a casino. The markets are a casino. Wall Street treats the markets like a casino and has for years. So to lament that Redditors are coming in and treating the markets like a casino is just laughable, because that's what you do on Wall Street. That's what they've been doing for years. It's exactly how they operate. And so the tools were created, by the free market. Robinhood is a creation of the free market that enables other people to, treat the markets like a casino, which is exactly what they are. So it's a total situation where you have just like the notion that anybody else could be profiting off of the system that they profit off of in a way that harms them, that they could possibly be victims in this game. That is sort of beyond the pale to them. So no, I think this is all neatly encapsulated by that line: the House always wins. And that's who our financial regulators in Washington are responsive to at the end of the day when push comes to shove.
One thing I found sort of interesting about this is sort of a meta narrative, and I know nothing about the stock market. I had to to read a lot of how-tos about what is a short, but I think one of the broader themes I noticed was that, a lot of the critique was, well, this kind of volatility shouldn't exist in the market. It's bad for everyone, that they're doing this. It might, disrupt the system and burn the system down. And a lot of those same Redditors and a lot of the people that were on their side were like, good. I'll be, I want to see the system burn. I won't be any worse off if the system burns. And that to me is a very dangerous way, it says a lot, I think, about where certain groups are in this country, that they actually don't think their situation would change at all if it burned down. And, the elites always like decry populism, and they don't like populist leaders, and, the speed and fury at which populism flows. This is how you get more of that. And it always shocks me that these people don't see the connection there. So that was my non-financial savvy take on the GameStop issue.
Yeah, so I don't have quite the financial industry background that Ben has as an ex-banker, but I follow the market every day. I at this point I'm mostly a kind of a buy and hold long-term investor for my retirement accounts. I sound like a grandpa at that point, I realized. But kind of earlier when I was fresh out of college and was so happy to be making like permanent income for the first time, I used to play the market like a little more aggressively. I actually have like short sold in the past. So I don't have any kind of intrinsic animus against hedge funds doing what their name suggests, hedging themselves. That's kind of their entire business model. But this story is just so fascinating to me from so many different perspectives. And Ben should comment on this if he wants to, but the notion of a brokerage house, increasing margin calls when a stock is particularly volatile, it's kind of, my understanding is that's a pretty standard thing to do. And, when the stock market does get increasingly volatile, we saw this back when the market started crashing last March during the lockdowns, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ oftentimes kind of put a halt when the VIX, the volatility index, kind of dramatically spikes in a given day. So none of this is necessarily that out of the ordinary until you kind of scratch underneath the surface a little bit. And if you scratch underneath the surface, some more curious things come up here. Janet Yellen, in her time away from government during the Trump administration, was on the speaking circuit, right? And she started taking like multi-$100,000 speaking fees from gargantuan investment funds like Citadel. Citadel happens to be closely tied here to what Robinhood did in terms of stopping people from buying the underlying GameStop and only allowing you to short it, if I recall, is what Robinhood did here. So if you scratch a little bit, there seems to me to be a lot of stuff that ought to be investigated. And we kind of saw this in bipartisan fashion. To me, this whole story was just kind of humorous until the Robinhood element kicked in. And then we saw people just outright stopping buying. And if you believe on Twitter, there were some financial services industry reporters, blue checks on Twitter, who said they talked to people who had last Thursday, their GameStop forcibly sold against their will. They didn't execute those trades. So there really ought to be investigation here. Everyone from AOC on the left to Ted Cruz on the right was kind of calling for this. More generally, though, I agree with everything that what Rachel and Emily said. It does seem like the stock market, to an extent here, is getting co-opted as yet another massive institution in America where, the deplorables play by one set of rules, the well-connected elites, the hedge fund play by another. It so easily kind of does fall into that narrative. And I'm sure there's some truth to it. There's some truth on the other side. It's a very nuanced situation, but we really ought to get to the bottom of it a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, the coda that I add, and there is sort of a parallel here with the big tech issue, is to the extent then the regulators are going to get in the game of trying to regulate message boards when people talk about what stocks they like and don't like is a really kind of disturbing thing when it comes to free speech. More broadly, I ultimately think this is going to end for a lot of people who are on the Reddit side. I think they all know that at some point, many of these stocks are going to crater. Many of them don't seem to care because, to Rachel's point, this is really all about just sticking it to the financial services guys now. So even if it ends in tears, they don't really care. Which is sort of a disturbing kind of situation that we're in. But I also think this will end in tears from the perspective of the fact that I almost guarantee that if there is regulatory action and or legislation that comes of this, under the guise of needing to protect the retail investor or trader, they will make it much harder for retail investors to compete against the institution. So however this turns out, I almost guarantee that from a regulatory and legal perspective, ultimately, once again, Wall Street will benefit, not the retail investors playing in a game that really is largely controlled by the big institutions in the first place.
So I'm going to take it from there and sort of come back around to where I started, which was complaining about Congress doing nothing. But Congress is actually doing something, and that is they're trying to kick each other out of the institution. And I want to talk about like this particular development, because I actually do think it's really concerning when we talk about, again, our institutions failing us greatly here in America. Our last representative body, I feel, is about to go down that road as well. You can argue it's been doing that, but there's an effort among Democrats just this week to expel a new Republican freshman member from the state of Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is a bombastic member of Congress, to be sure.
America's sweetheart.
What's that?
America's sweetheart.
Yes, America's sweetheart in many regards. She was sort of labeled by the New York Times as the QAnon congresswoman. And since coming to Congress, she hasn't been quiet. She sort of mixed it up with her office neighbor, Cori Bush, who's a progressive Democrat from Missouri. But Democrat leadership has uncovered a number of comments she made before being elected to office, sort of conspiracy theories about 9/11, about Sandy Hook, kind of all this stuff. And they're now bringing it to the fore and saying this woman should not serve in the Congress. I think Debbie Wasserman Schultz said, this is a dangerous member. We must contain this danger and not allow it to spread. And they're actually trying to expel her. And now members of Congress have the right to do this, right? Congress has the right to expel its members. It takes a very high threshold. But normally this has been seen as a sort of break glass, pull fire alarm way of dealing with the situation, where the last time I think the House did this was in 2002 with Jim Traficant, after he was federally convicted of bribery and a bunch of other actual legal corrupt activities. But what we are seeing now is, again, sort of this ideological assertion by members of Congress that if you do not think like I do, if you think ideas that I view as harmful, we will now expel you from a representative government. So you're seeing that with her, Marjorie Taylor Greene. This is kind of the same idea with Trump and his impeachment, although it's a little bit different. But here, again, democracy has worked. Trump is no longer in office, but we must punish him and take him off the field forever because, he did things that we disagree with. You're seeing this with Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz as well. Senate Ethics Committee is now looking into them for, again, you may question the political wisdom of what they did by objecting to electors, but that is a constitutional and procedural right that they have that has been exercised by members of Congress over decades. And so I'm very disturbed by this trend of weaponizing sort of representative government, and using it for wrongthink. Because again, this is not only about what Congress is doing to each other. This is, going back to this theme, a group of Democrats basically saying to the voters who elected Marjorie Taylor Greene, who elected Josh Hawley, who elected Ted Cruz, you have made a decision that we dishonor. We do not honor your choice. We will now decide for you whether you can be represented by this person. Okay, and again, what Marjorie Taylor Greene said was before she got elected, this was all out there and voters chose her anyway. And so I really think that this is we've leveled up, I think, in the danger we have toward our representative government, saying, again, voters don't matter. You think we're disenfranchising a whole group of people here. So I don't know if there's anyone wants to jump in on that, but Emily, it looks like you do.
I'm very eager to. I feel like while other cultural commentators were sort of feasting on the GameStop story last week, I was feasting on this. I think it's really, really a glaring example of what our ruling class does not understand about the public. I think you're completely right to be disturbed by the way politicians seem to want to wield their power in the House and in the Senate, whether it is Cruz and Hawley or somebody a little bit off the deep end like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think just about every responsible, conservative commentator would say the things that Marjorie Taylor Greene said were wildly off base and reckless. I'm sure we probably all agree on that. But when you have a population that has literally not a single institution to trust, whether that is the media, whether that is capital S science, which we've already discussed in this conversation alone about how we have scientific institutions telling us to recognize biological men as women, when we have legal institutions telling us to do that. You can go down the line of our institutions. The FBI, the level of corruption that has been uncovered in the FBI over the last 4 years, people in this country literally do not have anybody to trust. And I've been writing about Marjorie Taylor Greene actually since the summer, because she has a fascinating quote when she was sort of trying to explain away her flirtation with 9/11 conspiracies. She said, there's a lot of information out there, and sometimes it's hard to know what to trust. That is actually a line that kind of gives me chills. I will reiterate again, I hate doing this sort of obligatory conservative throat clearing, oh, Marjorie Taylor Greene's obviously crazy. This stuff is crazy. It absolutely is. But there's something so important to be learned from it, which is that literally there are people who have the capacity to be elected to Congress that do not know what information to trust. That's how difficult it is for people in the public who don't work in newsrooms, who don't hear off the record snippets here and there at cocktail parties. That's how hard it is for them to know what's actually happening in their representative government. And it is not their fault. It is Marjorie Taylor Greene's fault, no question about it, for publicly saying these things. She's the only one to blame for that. She's an adult. She's capable of parsing through information. But when you're an average citizen in this country and you have to pick your kids up from soccer and you have to work, maybe one job, maybe two jobs, you have to take care of your aging parents, you have all of these other things to deal with because politics and whatever's happening on CNN at any given moment isn't your full-time job. How are you supposed to know what's real and what's not? And that affects people in a way where you now have the House of Representatives, which is representative of the population and is going to have some people that the senators and people in the administration turn their noses up at. It's going to have more populists than the upper chamber. It's going to represent the public, and that's what Marjorie Taylor Greene is, and they need to deal with it. And I think the way that they're dealing with it is representative of the way that they want to deal with the public, which is just to dismiss anybody who's struggling with this very serious problem in our country as an idiot and a bigot and whatever else. And so they're not prepared to handle the situation at all, and they're very ill-equipped.
Yeah, because ultimately what I think they're arguing for, is almost like an HR department for Congress.
Yes.
Right. Like if you don't check box A, B, and C, if you don't think like we do, if you're not acceptable in polite society, how I define it, you don't get to serve in the government. And it just goes against the heart of what is our citizen legislature, right? The beauty and the exceptional part of America is that you can be, someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene running a business, again, parsing internet, chat rooms and believing what she believes. And you can get elected to Congress because that's the equity of the country that we live in. And, they are trying to, I think, in a really dangerous way, set up standards. And again, we go back to this notion of elitism, but that's essentially what it is.
Yes.
There's also a very dangerous precedent set here, right? I mean, trying to censure or outright kick out members of Congress for what they have done, or in this case, just stated in their life prior to Congress. I mean, is that really the road we want to go down? We want to look, what every crazy college newspaper op-ed that every, House leftist wrote in their, whack, drugged out liberal arts college. I mean,
you're gonna go back to junior high school. You don't even have to go. We're going way back.
Yeah. No, seriously though. I mean, this is like a ludicrous precedent to set on a first level. Look, to do the obligatory throat clearing, like Emily said, obviously this is Looney Tune stuff that she either professes to believe in, purports to believe in. I don't know. I frankly have not read a whole lot about her and her particularly idiosyncratic beliefs, to be honest with you. But I'll just make another point here. I actually have a piece coming out later today. We're recording this on Tuesdays. By the time it's unleashed, I guess the piece will already be out, for Claremont's American Mindside about the prosecution of the pseudonymous Twitter user who is a bad person, a very bad person, an anti-Semite racist, who went by the pseudonym known as Ricky Vaughn. And that prosecution, it's about memes that he made to try and deceive voters in the 2016 election. Just like that prosecution is not actually about Ricky Vaughn, what's going on here is not actually about Marjorie Taylor Greene. They are using the most extreme fringe extremist examples to try and define what is outside the Overton window. But the problem is that Overton window is always going to get shorter and shorter and smaller and smaller. Now, one thing that I do, and I have no idea why I do this, but I still subscribe to some of the dispatch emails. That's a Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg publication. And I was skimming their kind of a newsletter this morning. It was like the Capitol Hill update newsletter. And Haley Bird Wilt, if I recall her name is, was the newsletter writer. Towards the end of this newsletter, she has a source who's a Democratic Hill staffer. And in the newsletter from this source is a color-coded spreadsheet from this House Democratic office that basically lists all Republican congressmen, against color-coded, it's like red, green, it's like multicolored out there, based on whether you objected to the Electoral College results in Arizona, Pennsylvania, whether you did that and you signed on to Texas's amicus brief with respect to the Pennsylvania results, whether you did the latter but not the former. And what they're doing here is they're color coding you to try and, this is the regime trying to delineate levels of enemy. That's what it's trying to do. Who is permissible? Who can we work with? Who do we have to kick out? Who do we have to shun to the, the outside, the true pariahs of society? So I view stories like this, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the same way I view the prosecution of quote unquote Ricky Vaughn, whose real name is Douglas Mackey. These stories are not about these individuals. These stories are about the regime wielding regime level power to define who is a loyalist and who is an enemy and who ought to be treated as such.
Yeah, let me just make a couple follow-on points to that, and I think that's really well put. One is the power to destroy and disenfranchise ultimately hundreds of thousands and then millions of Americans is far worse than countenancing people with heterodox views or even views that are completely indefensible and detestable and deplorable. It far worse is to have a government that simply takes the power out of the hands of voters, which does extend really from this Congresswoman to President Trump and to putting Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley on no-fly lists and subjecting themselves to the ethics committee and the like. So that would be my first point. My second one would be also that there are like 100 Marjorie Taylor Greens on the other side, if not more, if you really want to go into the specifics, the substance of what they actually believe. So where is the Republican Party in saying that this is a smokescreen and look at your own house and look at the problems that you have on your side? And I know people would say that's whataboutism, but I just, the fact that Republicans respond in a defensive fashion to this and essentially are accepting the premise that she is somehow a representative of the party when she's no AOC or squad member, but there are tons of squad members on their side with equally out there views, I think is worth stating as well. But I do think the presidential question, precedential question of where does this ultimately lead, I think again goes to the idea that the establishments, the institutionalists, the ruling class in all of these places cannot tolerate anything that dissents from their perspective. And ultimately that reflects, again, the chasm between the ruling class and the ruled. And really, we shouldn't be ruled. I mean, we're self-governing people, but our purported representatives increasingly do not represent us. And how that ultimately gets reconciled, unfortunately, seems to be in a way that's very chaotic and a lot of turmoil and a lot of heartbreak and pain for the country, precisely because leaders are not being responsive to the people. Instead, they're trying to push any dissenting views and the dissenters who hold them underground. And ultimately, when you try to suppress competing views, instead of actually dealing with them in an open fashion, in an intellectually honest fashion, it ends up in disaster for a polity. And that's where I think we're headed, to the extent this enemies list sort of America that's really un-American continues.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I will say my final comment on this is, as someone who reads a lot of congressional history, we have a lot of kooky members of Congress. Okay, it is what makes our politics interesting, fun. And I think it's America, right? Not all of us think the same, and that's actually a feature, not a bug. But with that, is there anyone, go around the room, does anyone have any final wrap-up comments on our Elites versus America podcast?
It's really, that's the umbrella that all of our conversation falls under. It's very interesting that here we are, people on the right, and our conversations right now in 2021, we just, went through 4 topical items. And at the end of the day, we're all coming back to that central premise that these stories, whether they're about video games in the stock market or an executive order on sex and gender, at the end of the day, they come down to this fundamental and increasingly problematic divide between elites and the rest of the population. And I don't think that is just about the white working class. I think that's a divide that impacts people in cities and rural areas, working class, middle class, suburban, whoever you are. I think the elites are increasingly out of step with you and increasingly not working for you. And so, no, I just, I think it's interesting for us to sort of sit back and reflect that at the end of the day, all of this really fell under that broader umbrella.
Yeah, it seems to me that, my column from last Friday was, I don't remember the exact title, but it was America's Elites Seek to Rig the Game. And that's really what's going on here across any spectrum of society, any facet of society, no matter how you look at it. We alluded earlier to the late Andrew Breitbart's quip about how politics is downstream of culture. I think that's half right? We mentioned Terry Schilling from American Principles Project. Terry is among a vocal set of people who basically advocates for the precise opposite, that culture can actually be downstream of politics. I've always viewed this myself as kind of a two-way arrow. I think they both clearly influence the other. But here is kind of the bottom line conclusion that I think Terry and his like-minded folks would agree with. The right has no cultural power. The American right today has zero cultural power. There is not a single cultural bastion of society where we have power. The only institutions in America where the American right is theoretically capable of wielding and exercising power is the realm of politics. But of course, as we discussed in the previous podcast, and Rachel, you and I have discussed off camera any number of times, the right is terrified of wielding and actually using political power. So I just kind of summarize with the kind of just musing thought as to if, when, and ever the right will wake up to the fact that it has to simply wield the lever of power in the only institution that it controls, which is state governments, local governments, county sheriffs, prosecutors, local school boards. Now really is a time for red states to try and wake up.
Amen to that. And I think I said in the first episode, Republicans should always be thinking, what would Democrats be doing were they in an equivalent position? And until and unless we have that mindset, we can't expect to ultimately compete at the end of the day. I'll conclude with one kind of negative dystopic point and then one positive one. On the negative side, I think what we're seeing on Capitol Hill in terms of fencing around Congress and tens of thousands of National Guardsmen on call, essentially in Washington, D.C., is a microcosm of where we're headed to the extent the ruling class continues to run roughshod over everyone else in the country. And that is increasingly on their own island, cul-de-saced, surrounded by armed guards, separated from their fellow citizenry. And that's a disastrous place where we're ultimately going to end up. And for whatever benefits they think they get from promoting the agenda that they've promoted, do they ultimately want to raise their kids in a country like that? I don't think anyone should root for that. On the positive side, I think as a result of the egregious behavior that's been exposed on display as a counter response to our institutions actually facing some competition and challenges, is that the institutions are being exposed for what they are. That's a great thing for the American people. And it's actually leading to, in some sense, a weird kind of alignment between the right and the truly intellectually honest and, dare I say, liberal left, some figures on the liberal left, where we increasingly agree that concentrated power, whether in the public or private sphere, really does corrupt and ultimately does pose a threat to our most basic, cherished rights. And so maybe there is some hope that there is some common ground there, at least on the intellectual side. How it manifests itself politically and what we ultimately agree on or disagree on, or on the policy aspects of it, I think is to be determined. And probably we will never agree with the people on the left in terms of ultimately what the solutions are. But at the very least, it's somewhat heartening to see that this is sort of a time where the right and the left do unite in seeing our liberties and justice trampled upon by institutions where power has coalesced and come together to conspire against us all.
And leaving it on a high note. I like it. I'll take it. Thanks everybody for joining us. Please don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Thanks everybody. We'll see you next time.